Welcome to GRE Snacks, snackable episodes about the GRE exam and graduate school admissions. I'm Tyler, the founder of Achievable, and we have an affordable GRE course that includes everything you need to ace your GRE exam. This includes a full textbook, tons of GRE questions backed by our memory-enhancing algorithm, and full-length practice exams. You can try it out for free by visiting achievable.me, and if you like it, the code podcast will get you 10% off at checkout. Also, if you have a question or topic you'd like us to discuss in a future episode, please contact me at tyler@achievable.me with the subject line podcast topic. Now, let's get started. Today, we've got Oren Margolis from Pinetree Palm Consulting with us. And Oren, I would love if you could just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your company.
Yeah, happy to do it. Hey, Tyler. So again, Oren Margolis, the owner and only person at Pinetree Palm Consulting. My background's pretty varied. I worked in MBA admissions and also undergraduate admissions at NYU for about 6 years before embarking on a whole bunch of other professional endeavors and circling back to starting an MBA consulting business. I also do some career coaching and some other grad school admission stuff as well. But I'm a sole proprietor. I run a boutique firm. It's really only me. So what you hear is what you get. And I've been doing it for a number of years now with folks that have applied to, all of the top full-time MBA programs, but also part-time MBA programs, executive MBA programs, and then some assorted other grad programs. So really excited to be here.
Great. Yeah, and so today, you mentioned different types of programs, right? I think, makes you a good person to talk about this. How do you build an MBA school list that's going to set yourself up for success? I think a lot of times people, regardless of kind of where they're at, or just start their list by saying, what are the top 10 schools? Okay, that's where I want to go. And that's not really the right way to do it for everybody. So I'm curious, kind of take it from the top, right? Like, what do you feel like is the first thing you should do when you're starting to look at schools?
Yeah, totally. And I'll also caveat the conversation by saying my lens is fairly specific. Like when I talk about this topic and others, like my lens is pretty specific to MBA programs. So, it might be a little bit different for other grad programs. But, from an MBA perspective, it's like first thing that you're looking to figure out before you even decide to apply to an MBA program is like, what are my goals? Like, what do I actually want to get out of this whole endeavor? And so in the MBA landscape, like different schools can do different things for you, right? Like some folks are wanting to be a consultant after business school, or some folks are wanting to go into social impact. So you're actually looking like after business school before you're even looking to business school. So thinking like really critically, what are my goals professionally, but then also like, what are my goals personally? What are my restrictions? Like, do I have a significant other
Right.
who just got into grad school in Virginia, and so I'm kind of tied to the Eastern Seaboard? It's a good way to narrow down your list. Thinking about like what's the vibe of the school that I want. Do I want a school that has like a really well-known and close-knit student body? Am I comfortable being in the middle of nowhere? Do I need a city? Like all of those things are a good place to just like start that brainstorm swirl. And then the real like meat of what I will emphasize is like what's the right overall fit. And that takes into account so many things. And the number one thing I want to emphasize is like, while all the things I mentioned are important, academic fit is also super important. Like what's actually
Mhm.
realistic for me. And there are a couple of steps to figure out how to get there.
Yeah, so I think there's like kind of two follow-ups to that, but let's start with the one that you
Yeah.
just mentioned, which is like academic fit. How do you actually figure out where is a good, realistic sort of place for you to apply?
Yeah. And like my job and my MO is never to tell folks not to apply somewhere that they have their heart set on. Like I think people should feel empowered to apply like wherever they want, but they should feel empowered to apply there, um, understanding their odds and understanding like effort versus potential reward, right? So I see a lot of people who come to me from, from great undergraduate programs who have had great academic records, who have really strong career goals and basically have like all their ducks in a row for business school. And then I'm like, okay, cool. So like, have you taken the GMAT or GRE yet? And they're like, no.
Mhm.
And I'm like, okay, cool. You set like sounds
Well,
great.
now you
Sounds
kind of
like
don't know.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, you know, I think these programs could be realistic, but if you come to me in like 4 weeks and you've taken the GMAT and your score is like not competitive, it's going to be just like a really different conversation than if you're coming to me and saying, yeah, I got a 760. And that's just the reality of the process, right? So that's like one component of academic fit is the test. Also, undergraduate record. Um, and at least from a business school perspective, like that doesn't necessarily mean you have to have like a 4.0 GPA to be competitive for top programs. That's not the message that I want to send at all. Sometimes, that exercise is figuring out how to contextualize your grades and then get a killer GMAT or GRE score, and
Hmm.
and then position yourself really well for these schools. So there's a lot of factors that go into academic fit, but like at its core, testing, academic record in undergrad, any additional coursework you've taken between undergrad and grad school, and potentially from an MBA perspective, kind of like any effort you've shown to prove like quantitative readiness to excel in business school. Um, but
Hmm.
realistically, that's more of like an ancillary consideration versus some of the hard numbers.
So I'm curious, as far as figuring out like where you stand on the standardized test scores, that's
Yeah,
usually pretty straightforward. You can go to their website or you can Google it, and you can usually find like an average number. And generally
yeah,
speaking, if you feel like you'll be able to hit the average or go a little bit above that average, then you're probably fine, and you can kind of check that box. If you are substantially below the average, like, more than sort of 30, 40 GMAT points, or I don't know what the equivalent would be, maybe 5 GRE points, you should maybe work on that. But
yeah.
then the GPA part is not quite as cut and dry. And so I'm curious, like, how do you kind of evaluate what GPAs the school is going to be expecting, or what's an average GPA for the applicants of a school?
Yeah, I mean, schools usually publish both. So
Okay.
from a GMAT or GRE perspective, business schools are usually publishing the middle 80%, like the middle 80 percentile range, which is like pretty much covers it, right? So
Hmm.
if you're above that, awesome. Like no need to worry, you're clearly starting from a place of strength. If you're below that, like the question to ask is, am I one of the 10% that is so exceptional that I can make up for that with other qualities?
Hmm.
And maybe the answer is yes, and then shoot your shot. Like that's great. Um, yeah, but to your question, from a transcript or undergraduate record, it's a little bit more subjective, honestly. I mean, there are published ranges on all schools' websites, so it's always good to be in there. But that's one where there's so much more nuance to an undergraduate record than just a number. And even within that number, there can be variations. So you can have a 3.5 and have like, you know, mostly A's, but then like a handful of F's, and that's a problem. Or you can be like kind of like a solid B student with some A's and some C's, which is a little bit more kind of steady and solid. Um,
Right.
so there is more nuance there. Like from a business school perspective, it's like, hey, did you do well in quantitative coursework? Did you take quantitative coursework? And if the answer is no, that's not a deal breaker for MBA admissions at all. It's a big misconception that it is. Like plenty of people come in to programs with only like liberal arts coursework under their belt, and like that's why they're going to business school. So not a prerequisite. But for folks that do have evidence there, like if that's the weakness of your transcript, that'll be a hurdle to overcome in the admissions process. So anyone who's looking at these transcripts, like they look at thousands of them, so they get the nuance. Like they understand the strength of the program. They know that like organic chemistry, for example, is a legitimately very difficult class that a lot of people struggle in. Might be willing to throw you a bone there if that grade's like a little bit lower than some others in the
Hmm.
context of a larger transcript. Like they have a pretty good calibration bar for different schools, different programs, difficulty of different curricula. Um, so while the GPA number in MBA land is important and it's definitely not nothing, the number doesn't actually tell the whole story. So
Sure.
starting from a 3 point whatever is always good, but if that's not your reality, um, that's one where I don't encourage folks to like weed themselves out depending on what that looks like. That's sort of a like, you know, how do we strengthen that academic profile with testing, or how do we strengthen that overall profile with the story that you're telling?
Right. And so that actually is kind of a nice segue into part two of my question, which is like, what do you do with work experience, right? It's one of the biggest
Yeah,
differences between applying to an MBA program and applying to other types of graduate programs is that there's this whole third leg of the stool, which is your job performance from when you graduated until when you apply, which for the average MBA person is 3 to 5 years, right?
yeah.
So like I guess maybe like what are the kinds of job experiences that are going to help you, and then what are the kinds that maybe are not going to, like, what are the things in sort of your resume portion that are maybe not going to help you or make or be something that you need to compensate for with better test scores or better grades.
Yeah, I mean, what I will say is that like all kinds of job experiences are welcome at top programs, top MBA programs. And
Hmm.
like a big misconception is like, I got to have come from Google, or I got to have come from Goldman, or I got to have come from, one of these like quote unquote typical MBA career paths in order to be successful. Unless it's just like not true. Um, those kinds of those kinds of careers are easy for folks to make sense of and understand, especially if you've made some good progress, like some had a good upward trajectory, had promotions, that kind of thing. But I would say like most business school applicants to top programs are coming from pretty normal companies across a range of different industries, including those that are like quote unquote businessy or financy or consulting or whatever you want to call it, and also those that aren't. Like I've seen so many
Hmm.
teachers and writers and chefs, like you name it, that go to MBA programs to make a career pivot. The things that'll stand out though, the things that'll be a feather in your cap are showing progress, showing that if you come from a less traditional MBA career path, that you can pull out translatable skills and quantify your achievements. And, you know, depending on what you are looking to do after business school, like let's say you're a chef that's looking to become a management consultant, that's a big pivot, but not an impossible one actually. And so if on your resume you can tell the story of like what are the skills that I gain, what's the trajectory that I put myself on in order to be like relevant for a career in management consulting, that's like not a hurdle that's hard to overcome actually. That's like an impressive hurdle to have overcome. Um,
Hmm.
but for folks who have had a trajectory that like a resume that feels a little bit like dull or disinteresting, or there aren't many accomplishments or not even many like translatable skills pulled out, and you're articulating an interest in a career pivot or even like a lateral career move, but it's looking like it'll be pretty hard for you to make that jump. That's where the red flags start to come out.
Right. Yeah, and so then now that we've kind of outlined like the first part of it, right, which is like how do you kind of evaluate yourself and kind of your position. I'd
Yeah,
love to start thinking about like how do you actually build the list. I mean, the biggest
yeah, yeah,
thing
yeah.
first and foremost is that the top 10 list is the top 10 list kind of overall, but maybe not for the specific type of work that you're trying to do, right? For instance, like
Totally.
yeah, I'm sure like Harvard and Stanford have fantastic MBA marketing programs, but like technically Northwestern Kellogg's is the best, right? So it's things like that. So how do you start to figure that stuff out and to start to build your list that
Yeah, yeah,
way?
yeah. I mean, there's always internet research, which is kind of a given, but if you're going to business school, you got to get comfortable networking, because you'll definitely be doing that the second you walk in the door. And so, like all of these programs make themselves pretty available to students. So especially these days, it's like you can hop on a Zoom info session pretty easily. But more importantly, talking to current students and alumni, both of your business school, like both of some your potential targets, and also some that you might not have thought of, to get a feel for like what's the community like, what's the ethos of this school like, what are some outcomes that students have had, what are the like main like most prominent communities on campus, both personally and also like professionally. What are some of the professional centers that exist on campus? So If you're interested in real estate, is there a center for real estate that exists within that business school? If yes,
Hmm.
probably a good sign that that school has some proficiency or expertise. So really, like poking around and doing due diligence there, you'll find that especially in the MBA world, people are generally pretty happy to do a coffee chat or a quick networking session to share more. So a lot of it, I tell people to not discount gut feel, but also to think very carefully about, like to your point, Tyler, like ROI from a career perspective. Can What school can get me where I want to go? And maybe that's just the school that's ranked the highest, which is fine if that's a priority of yours. But maybe it's something that's a little bit more specialized. Maybe there is a programmatic element, and maybe there's something that might appear a little bit further down a ranking list that has either expertise in a career goal of yours, or has a community that really resonates with you, is in a location where you want to end up after business school, has a relationship with employers that are relevant to you. Those are all things to take into heavy consideration. And by the way, money can be a consideration too. These programs aren't cheap often. So, thinking about, if a school is potentially lower down on a list, but I know that I'm squarely in the mix academically, should I be rounding out my apply list with a couple of schools that I might be in the mix for scholarships with?
Hmm. Right. Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. And I'm curious, what do you feel like is a good, well-constructed MBA school list kind of at the end, right? Do you feel like how many, or what is the purport, like how many schools maybe total?
Yeah.
Um, and then like what sort of ratio of like reaches versus sort of in the middle versus, for lack of a better word, safety school. So I know that
Yeah.
nothing is a safety school in graduate school, but you get the idea.
Yeah, nothing's a safety school, but like depending on what your profile looks like, you can, especially in the MBA world, that can be a little less subjective, or less subjective. Sorry. Like you can generally calibrate yourself fairly well. But like I always tell people, like yourself best if you know your stamina, you know your staying power. Like I think more than like six schools is teetering toward a lot. Um, you
Hmm.
know, Most people who are applying to MBA programs are like pretty busy working professionals, so you've got other stuff on your plate, and you know, both work and life. Usually, like 4 to 6 is a good sweet spot. Um, I always tell people, like, people apply for different reasons. There are some people who are only wanting to go if they get into a very specific tier of school that's going to make it worth their while from a dollars and cents perspective, and I get that, and that's fine. If that's your approach, though, you also have to feel comfortable not going, right?
Right.
If you're only applying to Harvard and Stanford, I don't care who you are, there's a very real chance that you will not go to business school. So I don't advise that as like a realistic approach. I think it's always helpful for folks to at least plan on having some options. So, having the bulk of your school list be like targets, like realistic, probably can like am in the mix, even if they might be a little bit of a stretch, is a good way to go. And then having one or two that you're fairly confident you can get into, and then having a couple that are a reach. The only caveat I'll say to that is save your time and don't put schools on your list that you have no interest in going to. It sounds obvious, but I work with plenty of people who like they just want to have options, but they don't always like the options that they have. And that just doesn't
Hmm.
serve anyone well, given the amount of like time, effort, energy, money that goes into the process. And it just complicates things in the end.
Right. Yeah. If you only get into schools that you're not actually excited about in the end, I mean, I don't know. I feel like then you're just like, well, I guess I'm just not going. So then why even do it in the first place?
Yeah, or you force yourself, you put a square peg in a round hole and end up somewhere and paying a lot of money for something that you didn't always necessarily need or want in the first place. So it goes to like the front end of the process being like really crystal clear about what are your intentions, why am I doing this, what is the ROI I'm looking to achieve, what will help, like what will get me there. On the other hand, like I do see plenty of people who are mostly considering like a full-time MBA program, but might be comfortable doing a part-time program if full-time doesn't work out. And that's like a different conversation. But I don't encourage people to just like go buck wild and throw schools on their list that they're not interested. And for that matter, like really, don't have like even a fighting chance of getting into.
Right. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Any kind of parting thoughts on this topic?
No, I think we've had a good. I think we've kind of scratched the surface on this one. There's always plenty more to go on a school list, but the only thing I'll say is it really is customized for every individual. Like, depends on your goals, depends on your priorities. Talking it through with a diversity of folks, both who know you as a person and also who know what they're talking about from like an admissions or business school landscape perspective is always helpful. But there's not a one size fits all approach to crafting a list. I just encourage folks to be realistic with themselves and with their goals.
Great. Thank you so much. This has been GRE Snacks, hosted by Tyler from Achievable with Oren Margolis from Pinetree Palm Consulting. And Achievable has a great online GRE course that you can try for free by going to achievable.me. And if you like it, be sure to use the code podcast to save 10%.